Good morning. Today we're going to talk about stress and well-being, worker well-being. We're going to break this particular topic into 4 chunks today, and we're going to talk stressors and strains, and what are stressors and strains, and different models to understand it. Talk about work-family conflict and what organizations can do to help us with this work-family conflict. Then we're going to talk about what happens when we lose a job. I mean, what are the psychological effects? Very important construct. And then finally, workplace violence. Okay, so we've seen, unfortunately, too many of those workplace shooting news stories recently. So I'm going to begin here talking about stress a little bit from a general psychology point of view, not necessarily from an IO psych. So we'll do some general, stuff that would come out of psychology as a whole, and then we'll move it more towards the way IO psychology might. So an event in the environment is called a stressor, and we react to these events in the environment, and this is called a stress reaction. And stress itself is the process where we perceive events in the environment, we appraise them as something threatening or something challenging, and we respond to them. Okay, so stress is a good thing. I mean, without stress, what would be the point of waking up in the morning? I mean, you need stress, otherwise it's nothing. So stress is a good thing, but when stressors are perceived as threats, or if they're too large or too often, it's bad. So what stress tends to do is it triggers a fight or flight response. And the fight or flight response is the hormone response where the pituitary, what was it, the HPA axis, the hippocampus, pituitary, adrenal gland, something like that. The HPA axis is triggered. So stress hormones are released from the adrenal glands, and the sympathetic nervous system does things like increases heart rate and respiration. But what happens is when under stress, and we'll come back to some of these things later, when under stress and when our body is in the fight or flight mode, the fight or flight mode is getting you ready to fight or run away from some form of stress. If you are if you are in crisis mode, let's just deal with an emergency now. Guess what happens is things like your immune system kind of shuts down, because if you are in an incredibly stressful situation in front of you at this moment, you better divert all forms of energy to dealing with the thing in front of you. Okay? And so we find that the immune system gets shut down, but so does things like digestion. I mean, what's more important at this moment, dealing with the thing that's right there in your face, or digesting the peanut butter sandwich you had for lunch? It's like, okay, it's pretty straightforward. And so what we find is the fight or flight response was very, very adaptive in our ancestral past. With cavemen, stressors tended to be things like, there's a bear in front of you, rah, right? And we call that an acute stressor. And an acute stressor is like, the bear is there, you deal with it, and it's gone, okay? So acute stressors present themselves, the fight or flight mode kicks in, we react, we respond, problem solved, okay? So acute stressors is how our body is designed, but unfortunately, the modern world, especially once we start moving into IO psychology, has chronic stressors, right? Stressors that are day after day, like demeaning work environments, supervisors that belittle you. I mean, just on and on and on. So the 3 main models for understanding stress are the general adaptation model, the life change model, and the transaction model. And they all have some interesting things to teach us. The general adaptation model proposes that stress responses, stress reactions, occur in 3 stages: the alarm stage, the resistance stage, and the exhaustion stage. Whatever. And so here is an interesting image here, and what it says is, if you see what we have here is stress resistance low to high. And so what we find is on the far left is basically the body's natural state. In fact, there's a little line across the middle, I think, if you can see it. And that is like the average. And then what happens is when a stressor occurs, you see there's an immediate dip in our ability to deal with that stress. But then what happens is the fight or flight mode kicks in, our body pulls up all of its resources, we start to, we see that your ability to fight stress or stress resistance increases during phase two, right? During the, what do they call it? Resistance stage here. And so we're strong, we're good. But what happens is your body only has so many reserve energy, only so many sources to pull from. And so inevitably, if the stressor lasts too long, hint, hint, chronic stressor, and so if the stressor lasts too long, you can go into the third stage, exhaustion. And in the third stage, you just don't have any more resources to pull from. There is no reserves left, and we collapse. Okay? And we can get all kinds of stress related illnesses. The life change model of stress says, changes in our lives are the things that are stressful. And whether they be good or bad, large or small, it is changes. And so Holmes and Rahe put together the social readjustment rating scale back in the mid 60s. And what it attempts to do, and it's been updated, by the way, many times, is it tries to measure life change units. Okay, so what they basically did was they went to, and I know this because about 5 years ago, I worked with some students and we put together, instead of the social, we created the Wesleyan stress scale. We brought the stress scale up to meet modern stressors. And so Holmes and Rahe originally took these things and they said, okay, tell me what are the important changes in your life. And so they got a whole list. We'll even call them subject matter experts, right? We're going to SME it all day long. And so what are the major events in your life? And then they said, if these events happen to you, how much stress would it create in you? Okay? And so they ended up getting these average numbers. And so we see death of a spouse is a score of 100, whereas at the very bottom, minor, Christmas season, there you go, and a minor violation of the law like a traffic ticket are down there closer to the bottom. But again, Christmas season is a joyful time of year, but it's also a stressful time of year. Now that they've established these life change units, is what they're going to call them, then what they do is they ask people, in the last year, has this happened to you? And then they'll list all of these events, and you simply respond yes or no. And if you respond yes to one of these events, you get that life change score. If you respond no, you do not. Okay? And so according to the Holmes and Rahe scale, the life change model rather, if you have less than 150 life change units, chances are you're not going to get sick. Okay? If you have over 300 life change units, chances are you will get sick. And so clearly it predicts who will or will not get sick from stress-related illnesses. Well, when I brought this up to date a little bit, I did the same kind of a thing, but, and I asked subject matter experts, which were, of course, students like yourself, and some of the things that we added to the scale were just unimaginable in the 1965, and they were things like loss of a cell phone, oh my God, or broken cell phone, or Blackboard doesn't work when you need it to. Yeah, it is really stressful events for Wesleyan students. And so we created our own Wesleyan stress scale under the same model with change units, and I actually was using it to make predictions. By the way, it was completely different work, but I was using that Wesleyan stress scale to predict socially cooperative behaviors. I had a prediction that people that were under a lot of stress would turn inside themselves and become relatively selfish. And yeah, the data played out on that, by the way. Another model of stress is a transaction model of stress. And the main thing that you need to think about with this is that stress does not exist. Stress is something that you interpret, you appraise. And so look at this. There's a stressful event, a tough math test. You can appraise it as either, yikes, this is a threat, I can't deal with this. Or you can appraise it as a challenge, okay? It's time to focus my energy, trying to get everything I know, put it together, and get it going. And look at the reactions. Panicking and freezing up versus aroused and focused. So stress is not, no event is inherently stressful, okay? The way I sometimes say it is shit happens to everybody. It's up to you to determine how you appraise that, okay? Is it something that is life-changing to you, or is it just a bump in the road and you just roll on from there? So now here we're going to move into the way stress is defined by IO psychology. They're going to use slightly different words, but clearly the way IO psychology deals with stress obviously comes out of the basic psychological perspective. Okay, but stress in this definition, any disruptive force that pushes a psychological or physical function beyond its range of stability. That's interesting because I like that. Any disruptive force that pushes a physical function. It makes me think they're trying to define it based on like physics or something like that. A stress is something that makes a part in your product break or something. Whatever. And a strain is an undesirable personal outcome that results from the stressful experiences from various aspects of your life, not just work, but home as well. So stress is the force that disrupts your functioning. Strain is the outcome that occurs when your functioning is disrupted. Okay? And so the general stress model, as presented through an IO psychologist's framework, there we go. There are stressors in the environment, intrinsic work factors. I'll talk a little bit more about these. Role variables, relationships that you have, career development opportunities, etc. And these stressors lead to perceptions of organizational stress. So there is an acknowledgement in this model of the appraisal process that no stressor is inherently stressful, okay? It's up to you to appraise it in a lot of ways. Well, then, these perceptions of organizational stress in many ways lead to these strains. These strains can be job-related, emotion-related, or physiological. Remember, we talked about physiological. If you're under a chronic stress, your immune system tends to shut down, and that obviously leads to problems. But this relationship between perceptions of organizational stress and strains is mediated by coping strategies that we have and that we have inherited. So some of the intrinsic factors that are at the front end of this model, the front end right here, intrinsic factors and perceived control, like poor working conditions, long hours, long travel, bad parking spots, but all kinds of things. And what happens is these intrinsic factors lead to this feeling of a lack of control. And if you recall the learned helplessness notion, we can learn a general sense of helplessness. And by the way, I'm not doing it now, but I mean, those dogs that had been, remember the dogs that were harnessed and couldn't get out? Those dogs, when the light went on, and remember 15 seconds later they're going to get shocked, well, not only did they just lay down and quit and didn't even try his behavioral thing, but the amount of stress hormones released by those dogs was through the roof. As soon as that red light went on, boom, stress hormones came out. Okay? Stress, and then Carol, I don't know who this guy is. Demand control model of stress. Stress is a function of the psychological demands of work and the decision latitude, like how much flexibility you have in figuring out how to do. It's a version of perceived control. How much control do you have at work when things happen? Some other precursors in this model. Roles. A role is a set of behaviors that's expected of you. If you occupy a role, there's certain behaviors that you are expected to do. And so what happens is there can be role ambiguity and role conflict. Role ambiguity is where it's unclear what you're supposed to do. I mean, most roles come up with a pretty straightforward social script of how you're supposed to behave in that role. But if you're put into a role and it's unclear what you're supposed to do in that role, or even worse, if there's inconsistent expectations. And so all of a sudden you get role conflict. And so role conflict, say for example, I'll give you a role conflict in my job as a professor. My job, one of the behaviors as part of my role is to, of course, assign grades to students. And what happens is there's a push on and a pull on me. That is to say, students are pushing me for easier grades, and above me, administration and whatnot is pushing for harder grades. Not hard, but I mean, Slightly fewer A's, because of course we're talking grade inflation problems. And so we've got students pushing one side and then other forces out there pulling the other way. So it creates quite a bit of role conflict for me. Interpersonal relationships with supervisors, okay, things of this nature. There are other models of stress besides the general stress model. The job demands resources model. Stress is perceived when job demands are not met by available resources. So you're being asked to do more than the resources you have capable of doing it. And this is one of the inevitable effects of downsizing, is that as they downsize, more and more roles or demands are being placed on each employee. Um, it's difficult. You're somehow being asked to do twice as much with the same amount of resources. The conservation of resources model is this idea that individuals work and try to get resources that will help them ward off stress. And so losing resources, not necessarily higher demands, but the loss of resources plays a critical role in the stress process. And again, I mean, in these environments, when your equipment breaks down, often you're being told find a way to work without that equipment. So strain and the output on this model, the output on the general stress model, right? The three types of strains are job-related strains, emotional strains, and physiological strains. And so these effects of stress, right? Job-related strains lead to low satisfaction, less motivation. Emotional strains can lead to burnout, okay? Irritability and burnout, emotional exhaustion. Look at that, cynical views of work. I like that one. And physiological can, of course, be illnesses. Not just, as I said, the immune system shuts down, but there's other physiological problems that lead to heart problems. A lot of heart disease arises as a consequence of stress, but I'm not teaching that in this class. But yeah, heart disease is a common output from chronic stress. Management also gets stress. And so stress can be viewed in two different ways. And so this is what I've already said way up at the beginning with the appraisal process. But sometimes it's beyond appraisal. But anyway, challenge related stress is that stuff that is positive. That is, you need to challenge related stress. Here's a new project that forces you to really think and sit down and a good even sometimes projects, even if they are a lot of work, they're a good challenge. Okay, these are good. Hindrance related stresses, the kind, red tape, oh my god, okay, speed bumps that are just slowing you down. And so we find clearly challenge related stress is positively related to job satisfaction. People want to be challenged. They really do. They enjoy jobs with this kind of challenge. And it's negatively related to the job search. But this red tape, hindrance, stressors, this is the stuff that's negatively related to job satisfaction and definitely positively related to job searching. So how can we focus or cope with stress? And so there's a lot of ways, and I mean, I'm just touching the very, very tip of the iceberg here. Clearly, in the psychological literature, this is a huge field in and of itself. But coping, efforts to help manage and reduce stress, or more specifically, strains, right? Using the words they're using. Um, and often we find there's two main ways that people cope. There's problem-focused coping and emotion-focused coping. Problem-focused coping is that where you perform actions which are an attempt to solve the problem, something like that. Emotion-focused coping is using cognitive strategies to minimize the effects of the event. Okay, rather than trying to solve the event, you're trying to minimize the impact of the event. Okay, and so it again, you'd have to look at all the literature on this. This is way beyond this kind of a course. And so here we've got an interesting little chart. 21st century organizational changes. Hint, hint. Life changes equals stress. Holmes and Rawhead. Stressors that lead to stress. Wow, that was a lot of words. I really can't read it. Less supervision. Team culture. Interesting. Focus on quality. Downsizing. Mergers and acquisitions. Diversity. Yeah, so these are kind of the left column is almost like what shall we say? Moving into the 21st century, well, how is IO psychology changing, and how are organizations changing? And so these changes, and change is stressful. Okay, so I will come back in a few minutes and talk about work-life wait a minute, where am I? Signing off. All right, see you in a couple minutes.